Hola, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
The last time I wore a dress this stiff and unforgiving, I was standing next to a flag-draped casket, flanked by two men in uniform who couldn't meet my eyes for more than a second at a time. And yet here I was, years later, tugging at the hem of a floral nightmare my mother had picked out and insisted was just feminine enough for me to not make a scene at my sister's rehearsal dinner. I had driven 12 hours straight to be here, because apparently flying with military hardware and your checked baggage still raises eyebrows, even if you've technically earned the right to carry it. Not that anyone in my family would ask or care or even remember what that little rectangle of ribbon and metal actually means. No, they had other priorities now. Centerpieces, seating charts, Marissa. I arrived late on purpose, partly because I knew they expected me to be early, like always, and partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that the second I walked into that softly lit barn turned event space, someone would find a way to put me back in my balk in the way they always did, with a smile so tight it could slice through drywall. I parked 2 lots over and walked in alone, listening to the crunch of gravel under my boots, which I swapped out for heels only at the last possible moment, sitting on the tailgate of my truck and staring at the sky like I was gearing up for deployment. Same nerves, different battlefield. When I stepped inside, it took all of 3 seconds before I heard my name, not in welcome, not in celebration, but in that tone I'd grown up decoding, the kind that laces every syllable with judgment wrapped in politeness. "Oh, Jillian made it," my mother said, her voice carrying across the room like a knife wrapped in tissue paper. "And you wore the dress. Isn't she just precious, Gary?" she added, elbowing my father as if I were a poodle who had finally learned not to bark at guests. My father, true to form, didn't stand, didn't wave, didn't even look all that surprised to see me. He just motioned toward the chair next to him like he was assigning me to a workstation. I gave a tight nod and made my way over, exchanging a few hellos with extended family who offered vaguely uncomfortable smiles, the kind reserved for people you once knew before they grew into something you couldn't quite categorize. Most people had no idea what I'd done these past 10 years. That wasn't an accident. Every time I tried to share a piece of it, my mother would change the subject to someone's new dog, or my sister would sigh dramatically and say, "God, Jill, can we just talk about something normal for once?" I sat. My father cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, which had a wine stain from, I'm guessing, a rehearsal toast that I wasn't invited to, and leaned in so close I could smell his cologne, the same bottle he's used since Clinton's first term. And then he said it, so soft it almost didn't register the first time, but sharp enough that it sliced through every layer of armor I thought I'd built. "Try not to talk too much tonight," he said. "You tend to overshadow others." For a moment, I didn't breathe. Not because I was surprised. This was the man who once made me change out of my ROTC uniform before a family brunch because no one else is playing dress-up, but because some part of me still wanted, just for a second, to believe that he had changed. That maybe seeing my name in the paper, or hearing from his golfing buddies that his daughter had been recognized by the Pentagon, might have made a dent in his idea of who I was. But no, I was still just too much, too loud, too opinionated, too inconvenient, too Jillian. So I did what I had done in war zones, in foreign briefings, in sandblasted rooms where one wrong move could end everything. I smiled, I said nothing, and I listened. I listened as my sister gave a speech that sounded like it had been cobbled together from Pinterest and thinly veiled digs at me. I listened as my mother laughed just a second too loud when someone joked about women who can't find a husband because they're too busy trying to be one. I listened as my father raised a glass and toasted the future of the Parker family, without once looking in my direction. And just when I thought I could fold it all up inside again, just when I'd convinced myself to get through the night without making waves, a voice rang out from the front of the room, calm, clear, unaware of the landmine he had just stepped on. "I know I'm just here to bless the couple," the minister said, smiling warmly from behind a wooden podium. "But before I begin, I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to acknowledge someone very special in our presence tonight. We are honored, and I mean truly honored, to have with us the recipient of our nation's highest military decoration for valor. Miss Jillian Rose Parker, would you mind standing for a moment?" And just like that, the entire room turned to me. My father's glass stopped midair. My mother blinked 3 times like someone had unplugged her. My sister, already flushed from her 4th wine spritzer, looked like she'd been slapped with a salmon. I didn't move. I didn't nod. I didn't speak. Because for the first time in 20 years, I didn't need to. Let them sit in it. Let them stew in the silence they always demanded from me. I was done being their secret, their accessory, their background noise. And even though I hadn't spoken a word, something had just begun. There was a beat of silence after the minister's words. One of those hollow, airless moments that stretches unnaturally long, as if time itself had paused to see whether I would rise to the occasion or keep myself contained within the box my family had so carefully decorated with ribbons of politeness and silence over the years. Eyes turned, forks stopped clinking. Even the kid at the far end of the table, too young to care about anything besides the mac and cheese on his plate, stopped mid-bite to follow the collective gaze of the room, now fixed squarely on me. The shadow at the edge of the celebration, suddenly thrust into center stage, not by choice, but by recognition, genuine, unsolicited, and completely unwelcome to the people who had spent their lives pretending there was nothing about me worth honoring. I stood slowly, not out of modesty, but because I knew the weight of that moment wasn't mine to carry alone. It belonged to them too, the ones who had spent years minimizing every medal, mocking every deployment, and pretending that what I did overseas was somehow less valuable than what they were doing here. Building businesses, raising kids, keeping up appearances. I didn't smile, I didn't nod. I just stood there, in that ridiculous dress that still smelled faintly of lavender sachets and department store plastic, and met the eyes of every single person in that room who had spent the better part of a decade pretending I was a story they didn't have time to read. The applause was hesitant at first, as if people weren't sure whether they were allowed to clap without some kind of family permission slip. But then it gathered momentum, louder, firmer, more confident with each second, like the room was remembering that they weren't just wedding guests, they were citizens, and they were standing in front of someone who had once taken a bullet for the country they'd all posted flags for on social media every 4th of July. The minister smiled again, clearly unaware that he had just set off a chain reaction that would ripple far beyond this evening. "Thank you for your service, Miss Parker," he said warmly, and then gestured for me to sit, which I did slowly, as if trying not to crack the delicate shell of tension that had fallen over my family's table like frost. I could feel my father's jaw tighten beside me, could practically hear the math being done in his head, the calculation of optics, reputation, how many guests he would need to explain this to, and how many might now Google my name out of curiosity. My mother's lips were pressed so tightly together I was convinced she might rupture something internal. And Marissa, dear darling Marissa, looked like she had just watched someone else blow out the candles on her cake. Of course, she recovered fast. That was always her gift. She leaned into her wine with the kind of theatrical sigh that announces you're about to take center stage again, no matter who accidentally wandered into your spotlight. When it was her turn to speak, because of course she had a speech prepared, laminated and everything, she began with a giggle that belonged to a sitcom character from a show you watched once and regretted. "Well," she said, holding her glass aloft like some budget queen of hearts, "after that surprise detour into military history, I suppose I should bring us back to love." There were a few chuckles, light and awkward, the kind that people offer when they don't know who the joke is on, but she wasn't done. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she continued, her voice syrupy and loud, her gaze occasionally darting toward me, like she couldn't help but poke the bear. "This has been the most amazing year, between the engagement, the job promotion, and finally closing on the lake house. I just feel so blessed. And I have to say, I couldn't have done it without the quiet support of people like my sister Jill, who always stayed in the background cheering me on, even when she was, off doing her thing. her thing. As if carrying wounded comrades out of a blown-out village was equivalent to baking a Pinterest cake, or rescuing a rescue dog for Instagram points. The crowd, not quite sure how to respond, offered some scattered applause again, polite but uncertain. My father cleared his throat. My mother reached for her wine, and I stared straight ahead, feeling the old itch return, the one you get when you've been made invisible so many times you start to wonder if you actually exist in their reality at all. I didn't respond. I didn't interrupt. I didn't let the heat in my throat spill out as words. I just watched, listened, and let the applause fade. But something had shifted, not just in the room, but in me. I realized sitting there that I didn't need to defend myself, didn't need to correct the record or explain the medals or recount the nightmares that still woke me up some nights in cold sweat. I had already done my part. I had already earned my place. What I needed now wasn't their validation, it was a reckoning. Because when someone builds their entire identity around being the center of attention, the most devastating thing you can do isn't to steal it. It's to let someone else give it to you, honestly, unexpectedly, and without your asking. And then stand back and watch what happens when they realize the spotlight has a mind of its own. By the time the plates were cleared and dessert was being served, I had made my decision. I would not confront Marissa. I would not pull my father aside for another whispered disappointment. I would not explain myself to people who had decided long ago they were not interested in understanding. No, I had something else in mind. Something quieter, cleverer, and far more permanent. They wanted me silent. Fine, I would stay silent. But I would not be invisible. I lay awake most of that night in the guest room they had given me, Marissa's old childhood bedroom, now turned into a carefully curated Pinterest shrine to her teenage years, complete with varsity cheer trophies still crowding the bookshelf, a whiteboard on the closet door with a faded doodle of a heart labeled Senior Prom, and posters of pop stars that hadn't aged as well as they were supposed to. The sheets smelled like fabric softener in disuse, and the light from the hallway crept under the door just enough to make sleep feel optional, which was fine, because sleep hadn't come easy in years, and tonight of all nights, it felt more like a luxury I couldn't afford than a necessity I actually needed. I stared at the ceiling, tracing invisible lines between the glow-in-the-dark stars someone had slapped up there. In another life, and I wondered, not for the first time, what it would have been like if I had taken the other path, the expected one, the one where I stayed close to home, majored in marketing or communications, wore cardigans to brunch, and pretended my voice was just another decoration in someone else's narrative. But that version of me never made it past 18. She died the day I walked into the recruitment office, signed a form that would take me across oceans, and never once looked back. Not even when my father told me it was a phase. Not even when my mother cried like I'd announced I was moving to Mars. Not even when Marissa sent me a text that said, "Are you doing this for attention?" The silence in that room pressed against my chest, not heavy like grief, but dense like resentment that had been bottled too long and was now beginning to ferment. I grabbed my phone, flicked through the notifications, wedding updates, tagged photos, smiling faces at last night's dinner, and found myself staring at a picture of the toast, the one where the minister had mentioned me. Marissa had cropped it. I knew this not because I was vain or particularly attached to being visible, but because I remembered where I was standing in the original photo. I remembered the look on her face, and in this version, that part was gone. She had cut me out of my own moment, like I was a smudge on the lens, something unsightly she didn't want ruining her aesthetic. I opened her profile and started scrolling. Every post from the last year painted her life in watercolor pastels and filtered sun flares, lake house selfies, wine nights with captions about self-care, side-by-sides of her and her fiancé, at fundraising galas with vaguely patriotic hashtags that made my throat tighten. In one photo, she was standing in front of a military family donation banner, holding a check with a smile that made my skin crawl. The caption read, "Honored to support our brave heroes, especially the ones in my own family. We see you." It had nearly 300 likes. One of the comments said, "So inspiring. Your sister must be so proud." I stared at that comment for a long time, not because it was sweet, but because it was so achingly, stupidly wrong. Proud? Proud of what? That she used my face, my story, my silence, to score points with people who'd never ask questions. That she sold a sanitized version of my life while I was too tired, too battered, or just too damn busy surviving to offer the truth. My thumb hovered over the screen, and for the first time in years, I considered saying something. I could comment, I could post, I could finally tell the story. Not the press release version, not the sanitized one that showed up in the newspapers with my picture in uniform and a headline about valor, but the real one. The story about that night in Kandahar, when our convoy was ambushed and the lead vehicle exploded so violently that the sky turned red before the dust settled. The moment I realized the radio was dead, and it was just me and two others pinned down and bleeding behind a twisted pile of metal while insurgents moved in. The decision to drag Sergeant Hayes, who outweighed me by 40 pounds, 200 meters to cover, while bullets chewed the earth around us. The fact that I almost didn't make it. That I still hear his voice, broken and rasping, telling me not to stop, even though his lungs were collapsing. That I was covered in his blood when we reached the evac point. None of that was in the newspaper. None of that showed up on Marissa's feed. I opened my notes app. My fingers hovered for a moment before I started typing. Not a rant, not an exposé, but something closer to a record. I wrote the date of the mission, the location, the names of the men we lost, the number of times I'd had to rewrite the story in therapy just to make it bearable. I didn't plan to post it, not yet, but I needed to see the truth written down in my own words, not the soft focus version my family had been using as decoration. When I finished, I saved it as a draft and closed the app. Then I started another note, this one shorter, colder, and much more precise. A list, really, 5 bullet points. Each one tied to a moment in the past 48 hours that had cut me deeper than I wanted to admit. The whisper from my father, the applause I wasn't supposed to receive, the speech from Marissa, the cropped photo, the fake veteran support post. 5 moments, 5 offenses, each one sharp enough to justify what I was planning next. Because they had spent years treating me like a ghost who only appeared when they needed to look patriotic or honorable or generous. And maybe it was time for that ghost to haunt them, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with something far more effective. Facts, stories, receipts. I closed my phone and set it on the nightstand, next to the untouched welcome basket my mother had put together for guests. The label on the water bottle said "Hydrate and Celebrate." The granola bar wrapper had a sticker that read "Love is sweet." I stared at it for a long second, then picked it up, unwrapped it, and took a single bite before tossing the rest in the trash. If they wanted a version of me they could crop, quiet, or quote out of context, they were going to be very disappointed. Because tomorrow, I wouldn't be quiet. I wouldn't be cropped. And I sure as hell wouldn't be sweet. By the time morning cracked open like an egg over the vineyard hills and flooded the world with golden light that felt more accusatory than peaceful, I was already awake, already dressed, already prepared. Not in the conventional sense with hair curled, lashes glued, or face painted into the bridal palette my mother had passed out like gospel, but armored, grounded, and calculating every step I took. As if the venue were a minefield, and every exchanged glance could trigger an explosion that might not leave visible scars, but would absolutely scorch something inside me if I wasn't careful. The day of the wedding arrived, not with the kind of nervous excitement most people associate with love stories and fresh beginnings, but with a sort of inevitable dread, the kind you feel when you know a train is coming and you're not sure whether you're standing on the tracks or watching from the platform. The ceremony was set in a manicured garden behind the estate house. White folding chairs arranged in precise symmetry like obedient soldiers, flowers in tightly bound mason jars hung from hooks at the aisle's edge, and a string quartet playing something soft and expensive that tried to tell us all this day was gentle, sacred, and good. I sat in the second row, not by choice, but because Marissa had texted me that morning. assigning me the seat as if she were placing a reluctant intern in a high-stakes boardroom and wanted to make sure she could keep an eye on me. No one spoke to me as I arrived. My father nodded once. My mother offered a smile that didn't travel past her teeth. And when Marissa walked down the aisle like she was descending from a cloud made of peonies and entitlement, she didn't glance at me, not even once, though I saw her eyes flick toward the other guests, as if confirming that all lenses and all attention were exactly where they belonged. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows so generic, I could have found them printed on the inside of a Hallmark card, promises as soft as they were meaningless, and laughter from the groom's side of the family that felt rehearsed and overcompensating. They were kind people, ordinary people, unaware they'd married into a family that weaponized silence like a scalpel and viewed individual accomplishments as threats, unless they were made by someone within the golden perimeter of maternal favoritism. I smiled politely, I clapped when appropriate. I even stood during the recessional and threw flower petals like everyone else, knowing full well that no one would remember whether I had or hadn't. But some part of me needed to document the fact that I tried, that I was the one who showed restraint, who held back, who gave them every possible opportunity to do the right thing before the scales tipped. The reception began in the ballroom, a space dripping in chandeliers and linen napkins folded into swans, a place designed not for intimacy or joy, but for photos, for image, for curated perfection. The seating chart placed me at a table near the back, not so far that it could be seen as an insult, but distant enough that my presence wouldn't interfere with any toasts or camera pans. Marissa was seated like royalty at the elevated head table, flanked by bridesmaids, who all looked vaguely afraid of her, and when the music shifted to dinner jazz and the clinking of forks and glasses began to fill the air, I slipped away to the bar, not to drink, but to prepare. The bartender was a thin man with tired eyes and an expression that said he'd seen more family dysfunction in 1 year of weddings than most therapists do in a decade. I liked him immediately. I slid a folded napkin across the counter and said in a voice low enough to be ignored by the crowd, but direct enough to be heard clearly, "I'd like you to read this, not now, just before the cake cutting, out loud, word for word, no edits. Can you do that?" He looked at me, looked at the napkin, and nodded once. No questions. Just a quiet agreement born of a man who'd stopped being surprised by anything. I returned to my table, the corners of my mouth twitching toward a smile that never fully arrived, and watched as the night began to spiral, the way weddings always do. Too many drinks too early, someone crying in a bathroom stall, toddlers face-planting into cupcake towers, and old family friends oversharing medical updates between courses. Speeches started. The best man told a story that involved too much alcohol and not enough discretion. Marissa stood up and, in her 5th outfit change of the day, delivered a second monologue, this time about the journey of sisterhood, how, despite differences, true love within a family always finds its way home. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. Her entire speech was crafted to turn me into a supporting character in her triumphant narrative, a redemptive footnote about a misunderstood sibling who, through the magic of wedding forgiveness, had finally come around to see the light of Marissa's path. And still I said nothing. I toasted, I clapped, I danced once with an elderly uncle who called me the quiet one and winked as if it were a compliment. I waited, I watched, and then as the music dipped and the MC called for attention, signaling the traditional cutting of the cake, the bartender stepped forward with the napkin in hand, cleared his throat, and tapped a spoon against a champagne flute. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," he said, and even before he unfolded the napkin, I saw my mother's back stiffen. This is a short message written by the bride's sister, Jillian Parker. She asked that I read it aloud. And suddenly the air in the room changed. Not violently, not dramatically, but undeniably, like the barometric pressure before a storm, or the moment the tide shifts direction and you're too far from shore to pretend you don't feel the current dragging something unfamiliar into view. He began to read, and I began to breathe. The first words left the bartender's mouth with the kind of gravity that doesn't come from performance, but from the awareness that what he was about to deliver was not a toast, not a blessing, not a speech wrapped in glitter and etiquette, but a quiet detonation placed gently into the middle of a ballroom full of people who had spent the last 48 hours pretending that everything and everyone was exactly as it should be. The napkin trembled slightly in his fingers, just a thin square of cloth holding the weight of years unspoken, pressed and folded not for presentation but for precision. And when he began reading, his voice didn't rise above the noise. Instead, the noise fell to meet it, silence unfurling like a wave, crashing softly across linen-covered tables and champagne flutes with unfinished toasts. To those of you who have spoken to me tonight, thank you, he read, his voice steady, measured, and utterly devoid of ceremony, which somehow made it land harder. You may not have known what to say. Maybe you were unsure of who I was or why I looked so familiar. Maybe someone whispered, "That's the sister," and left it at that. So let me make things clear. I am Jillian Rose Parker, the older sister of the bride, the daughter of Gary and Eleanor Parker, and a woman who has served this country for over 15 years. Across 3 continents, through 2 wars and 1 homecoming that never really came. The room was frozen. Not in shock exactly, but in discomfort, the kind that comes when people are forced to sit with truths that do not flatter the host. I didn't stand, I didn't wave. I just sat still in my chair, hands folded in my lap, chin slightly raised, eyes steady on the speaker who was now, for a few short minutes, the vessel for a truth too long buried under layers of family performance and well-rehearsed denial. I did not write this to shame anyone, he continued, pausing only long enough to let the implication linger in the air like static before a lightning strike. But I also didn't write it to protect anyone, because for too long silence has been mistaken for politeness and patience has been mistaken for weakness. I have been applauded by generals and ignored by my own father in the same month. I have received medals from strangers and apologies from no one. I have walked through hell in a uniform, only to return home and be told to dress more feminine so I wouldn't ruin the holiday photos. My mother gasped audibly, though whether from recognition or indignation, I couldn't tell. My father remained motionless, but his eyes were locked on the bartender now, as if trying to will him into silence by sheer force of denial. Marissa had turned to face me, her mouth open, stunned into the kind of silence she had so often demanded from me without ever knowing its cost. I have been asked to be quiet at my own family's table so others could shine brighter, he read. And at that, several heads turned toward my father. I have watched my accomplishments be edited, cropped, and captioned in ways that made them palatable, less intimidating, more digestible for dinner party guests. I have been made small in rooms I bled to defend. And tonight, as I watched my sister's 5th speech and my father's 2nd toast, I realized something. I was never meant to be invisible. I was made invisible. The tension in the room had shifted from vague discomfort to something heavier, something bordering on collective guilt. People were no longer glancing at their phones or waiting for cake. They were holding their breath, realizing that the real event had just begun, and none of them had dressed for it. I do not begrudge celebration, the bartender continued, clearing his throat gently, as if to keep his voice from catching on the edges of someone else's pain. I do not resent joy. I love my sister. I admire her success. But I also know that love without honesty is just performance. And I've seen enough performance to last me several lifetimes. So tonight, I leave this note not as revenge, not as rebellion, but as reclamation of my story, of my name, of my silence. He folded the napkin with care, placed it back on the counter, and said nothing more. No applause followed. No murmurs filled the silence. The string quartet in the corner remained frozen, bows suspended midair, the moment too fragile for music. I stood quietly, deliberately, and as I walked past my family's table, I saw my mother's hand reach out slightly before retreating like a nervous reflex. my father staring at the untouched wine in front of him, and Marissa blinking rapidly as though she were still trying to make sense of how the room had turned without her permission. I didn't stop. I didn't say a word. I didn't offer comfort, closure, or clarification. I walked through the open doors of the ballroom, down the gravel path that led toward the guest parking lot, and into the night that greeted me not with celebration, not with forgiveness, but with something far more satisfying. Freedom. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, with shouting matches and grand gestures. It was something smaller, deeper, and sharper. It was walking away without the need to be understood. It was choosing to be whole, not palatable. It was knowing that every person in that room had heard what they were never supposed to hear, had seen what they were never supposed to see, and would carry it with them, not because I demanded it, but because I finally stopped allowing them not to. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the DJ's music pick up again, awkward and misplaced, as though trying to patch the hole with rhythm and volume. I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. My story had already been told. Not for them, not for likes or forgiveness or family unity, but for me. Because sometimes the most deafening truth comes from the person who says the least. And sometimes the loudest revenge is not a scream, but a single undeniable whisper spoken into a room that can no longer pretend it didn't hear.